All right. So, I wanted to make one last video about really drilling down deeply into this idea about something necessarily coming from nothing. So, what I'm getting at with uniterated nothing, like if you were to just imagine this in your head, there is nothing, right? There's not anything there. Okay. Well, if there is not anything there, then we can be certain that there is not anything there. We can be certain about something given this moment in time or this place in space or whatever, some abstract concept, whatever you want to consider. There cannot be anything else except it. So it really defines what purity is. Nothing is absolutely perfectly pure. There's no, it has no tolerance or ability to deal with anything other than itself. If you were to try to couple nothing with anything else, it will automatically exclude it. It cannot be included in nothing. Nothing is exclusive to everything except itself. So, if we started with nothing, then we know that we're starting with only nothing. And it's the onlyness of nothing that makes nothing iterate into a happening, a certainty. Because if you look at modality, this is where it gets really trippy. If you look into modality, what makes something a certainty, such as like the conclusion of a hypothetical syllogism given the truthhood of the premises, the conclusion must also be true. That level of certainty, that certainty is defined by there not being any other possibility other than itself. What do you know of that's more certain than the statement, from nothing, there must only be nothing? I mean, it's basically a cliche. If you start with nothing, you're gonna get nothing. Every single theory out there assumes something. It assumes it with no justification because it has to. Why? Because if you start with nothing and you don't assert anything, then you end up with nothing. But here's the really fucking trippy thing about that. That is a fact, and that is a certainty. If you start with nothing, then you end with nothing. Is a certainty. So if you start with nothing, you can't end with nothing because you end with nothing and the fact that you end up with nothing. You can't erase the fact. Now you can say, well, facts are created by people, by subjects, and considering that there's only nothing, there can't be a subject to create these facts. I disagree with this. I think that there are such a thing as facts that are independent from people, but let's say that that's true. So if facts only exist dependently upon subjects, that every fact must have some subject that created it, then who created the fact that 2 + 2 = 4? Was that the first person who ever wrote it down? Was it the first person who ever thought of it? How did they think of it? And if it was true, then was it not true before they thought of it? And if it was true before they thought of it, then they didn't really discover it or invent it. They didn't invent it. They discovered it. It pre-existed the person that was thinking about it. I personally believe that 2 + 2 = 4 was true before the first human ever discovered that that was true. I think it was true before they discovered it was true because they didn't make it become true. So if a human can't make something become true, then they can't make a fact. So something is true independently of whether or not there's any human or any other sentient creature to determine whether or not it's true. It's true independently of the person determining its truthfulness. If that were not the case, then how is it that there are things that are true that people think are untrue? For example, people used to think that it was true that the earth was flat. We now know that it isn't. So obviously there's some falsehood there. Now, how is it the case that people believed this falsehood if people are the very ones that are supposed to be creating these facts? Was it that the facts changed, or was it that the people changed? I think the people changed. And if the people changed, then we can't determine whether or not the facts changed. Because we know that the people changed, then it might be the case that when they changed, the way that they looked at facts changed. And if that's the case, then again, the people have changed. And so if the people have changed, and that's why it is quote unquote no longer a fact that the earth is flat, I would posit to say that the earth was never flat, and that people just thought that it was flat, and that therefore people can't be the total arbiters of truth, but that truth pre-exists people. And the way that we determine what is true means that there has to be something which is true before we determine that it's true. Our determination of it being true can't be what makes it true, because our determination of what is true is timeless. It doesn't have regard to time. It only has regard to whatever it is that we're asking about. But the measures that we're using to determine whether or not it's true are timeless. They don't require time. What they require is, are you checking to see what is true based upon logical validity and integration, the ability to coherently explain it without having to invoke some magical thing that doesn't make any sense, some logical fallacy, some other irrational linkage between premises, and then we just assume that the premises are true? Or do we go even further and apply not only that, but also empirical soundness? Has anybody ever actually verified this to be the case? Well, with mathematics, it's very simple. If you use mathematics on your account book, on your budgeting, on your money, you'll very quickly see that mathematics is true and it is real. It does apply to empirical phenomena. So when you go out and you buy something in real life, then it shows up on a bill on your bill. In digital reality, it's reflected every time. So you can then say that the very same math that allowed you to arrive at the conclusion that you have X dollars in your bank account is the result of Y credits and Z debits to your account added together. So you've got your net paycheck, which is your Y additive credit, and then you've got all your bills as a totality as your Z deficit or debit to your account. And if you were to apply Y plus Z or Z, then you get X, and that's your total amount. And if your total amount is displayed on your bank account as the very same thing that you predicted that it would be based upon the value of your paycheck minus the debits, purchases that you made, then you can say that math is real. And so it isn't the case that people invented math, it's that they discovered it. Otherwise it wouldn't work independently of themselves. The way that you can tell whether or not something was invented or discovered is, can it operate independently of its quote-unquote inventor? Is it possible that the thing can exist without the person ever having come up with it? And if the answer is yes, then it's discovery. If the answer is no, then it's an invention. And you'll realize very quickly that there are no such things as scientific inventions. There's only scientific discoveries. If you made a scientific invention, then you invented something that didn't work. You invented a light bulb that doesn't turn on. You invented 1,000 ways of making light bulbs that don't work, as Edison put it. So you're not going to invent something that will ever work. If you're the first person to ever come across this idea, then it can't work, because if it works, then reality itself predicted that you'd be able to make that thing, because otherwise it wouldn't work. Otherwise the actual engineering and application of the theory would not match the predicted theoretical values. It would be a hypothesis that was never proven. So the only thing that we invent as humans are errors. We don't invent anything except errors. Everything else is a discovery, because it's actually true. It's something that's embedded and endemic and innate to reality itself. Long before we existed, there it was. But once we uncover that, then we have discovered it. We don't bring it into being, we bring it out of theory into practice and down to earth. So it isn't a bottom-up process, it's top-down. Now, with reality being the way that it is, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. If you just look at reality, you can say it's a bottom-up process, in which case you're saying that all the physical laws that we're able to derive are actually just accidents. They're just happy accidents of the fact that that's how matter works with energy and other pieces of matter. If you say that that's just the way that matter works, are you not also acknowledging that matter has a particular pattern of the way that it works, given the fact that these laws don't change? And given the changelessness of those laws, can you not then say that those laws are actually independent of us because they're changeless, because they've been there since before time, that they've always been there? Now, you could say, well, they didn't exist until they were brought into being by the interactions themselves. But then again, you can also ask, what is it that made those interactions interact the way that they did? Now, if you say that it is anything other than those laws, you'll notice very quickly that you're actually just saying it's the laws again. Because when you say it's anything other than the laws, and you say, well, that's just how matter works with itself. Well, is that not how the laws determine how matter works with itself? Isn't it interesting how matter always works with itself that same way? Isn't it interesting how it's very consistent how these interactions always form? That's why we have those laws. It's because they're consistent. And if it weren't for that consistency, then I would be obliged to say that, yes, it's an invention. But given the fact that they're so consistent, then it says to me that since they never change, then they've been there since before change, and time is change, therefore they're timeless, therefore we discover them. They were not invented. So, in other words, it's to say that if I were to smash an egg on the ground, that I would expect that the laws of physics were there before it smashed rather than after. Because if the laws of physics emerge after it's smashed, how did it smash that way? Well, that's just the way that the matter works. Then that's the law that governs how it smashes. It doesn't make any sense to say it any other way. It doesn't make any sense to say that the egg always smashes the same way because that's just the way that it smashes, without invoking the law that governs how it smashes. So it just doesn't make sense to me that anyone would ever believe that. It's kind of like saying that gasoline can work without an engine. It's like, I mean, you can burn it, but what's the point? It doesn't do any good. I mean, I guess you could do that, but it doesn't actually perform any real action. So I don't really understand why you would say that gasoline had that function of just burning for no reason out in the middle of nothing, independently of its ability to burn in an engine. Its ability to burn in the engine is because it has the ability to burn. It's not contingent on the way that the engine operates that the gasoline burns. It burns nonetheless. And then you put it in the engine because it burns. You don't put the gasoline in the engine because the engine operates the certain way that it operates. And then you just so happen to accidentally add some gasoline in, and that, oh, well, it so happened to work. The engine wasn't made before the gas. The engine was made after the gas was discovered because the gas burned a certain way. If people found it, that's why I say it's ludicrous to me for somebody to say that the laws of physics didn't precede the acts which made them the laws. It's like, how else do you explain the consistency between these interactions and the fact that we're even able to derive these laws given those consistencies without claiming that the consistencies are not consistent? The consistencies are consistent. That's why they're laws. That's how we know that the laws existed before the interactions took place. It's just insane. It's like, if the laws didn't exist before the interactions took place, then you're literally describing to me that we had engines before there was gasoline. It just doesn't make any fucking sense. The reason that we have engines is because of the way that gasoline works. We don't have gasoline because of the way that engines work. It's just crazy. It just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, so I think the original point of this all was the faith in God or not. So the faith in God says, there was no such thing as nothing. There was no such thing as these laws of physics yet, but they emerged as a natural consequence. And God emerged as a natural consequence of nothing being nothing, of nothing being intolerant and absolutely exclusive of everything except itself. And because of its absolute exclusivity, of its repulsion of all other things, it became a thing because it repulsed all other things. In the same way that a hole has dimensions because of the ground it's carved out of having dimensions. As soon as I dig a hole, I know how big it is because of how big the dirt that's been excavated from it is. It's the same amount. But yet the hole, having to contain those parts, being the soil, must then be larger than the soil. I mean, soil's a bad example because it can be squished and compressed, but imagine an incompressible thing. Like, let's say there was some lead or iron or something like that, or a diamond, and we carved out a little bit of it. The amount of diamond that you carve out is less than the crevice that's left by it. Always. So it's like, well, where did that go? It's not that it went anywhere. It's that if you were to take a box and put something in it, the thing that fits in it has to be smaller than it is. I mean, it's just simple, basic logic. It's just mechanical, obvious, self-evident logic. It's like, if you're going to have X fit inside Y, then Y has to be bigger than X. It can't be the same size as X because then X can't fit in it. It'll be the same size as it, but it can't fit in it. Everything that's in something is smaller than whatever it is that it's inside of. So it's like, yeah, you have to have a container that's larger than what's being contained. That's what happens when you have nothing and you have like uniterated nothing. It becomes its own container. And then in order to resolve that paradox, there has to be something that goes beyond it in order to resolve it, because it can't be resolved if they're both in the same place at the same time. So the only way to resolve the paradox is to invent a new place or a new time. And that way it can separate. That way the paradox can resolve. And so it's ultimately a paradox that drives everything in existence. It's a gasoline from which this engine has been built. And so you can say all you want to that, the engine was invented first. No, it fucking wasn't. Nobody invented a gasoline engine before they knew there was gas. Nobody invented a steam turbine until they knew that there was steam. Nobody invented fire. It just happened, man. It's there. Fire exists. And then we just take advantage of it or not, but it's there. Now, like I said, that does break the first commandment, because I'm saying that nothing created God. I'm saying that there was a nothing, and that the natural consequence of there being nothing is that you ended up with indiscernibility, and then as a consequence of indiscernibility, you ended up with being, because of the pervasiveness, and because of the ubiquitousness, and because of the absolute exclusivity and repulsion of nothing upon all other things. Ended up making it a static object, because like all static objects, it repulses everything around it so that it retains its own internal structure, despite the changes of its external environment. What object do you know of that changes its internal environment constantly? It doesn't. It stays static. It stays the same. It's changeless. If I take any object, whether it's a tin can or a cigarette, if I just leave it there and I do nothing with it, it will retain its exact properties. That's what makes it an object. It doesn't ever change. It just sits there and it stays the same. Unless somebody changes it, it's not changing. It doesn't have any internal changes. It just sits there. Now, that's the same exact thing that nothing does. Now, isn't that interesting? So what is mass? The resistance to change. It just sits there. All objects have it. Isn't that interesting? So what doesn't ever change? Nothing. So there you go. Now, with nothing, when it iterates, it becomes static. And what that does is it creates inertial momentum. Now, this is energy that doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't move. It's not kinetic. It's innate. It's intrinsic. It's like mass. It doesn't change. It resists change. So when you talk about nothing, you're actually talking about mass. And this mass ends up, exploding and causing the Big Bang and all this other stuff. That is because of the static nature of nothing being nothing, of nothing never changing. Well, if it never changes, then it resists change. If it resists change, then it's massive. If it's massive, then it's substantial, and it exists. In a physical sense, it exists. And that's the first moment, according to lucidity, is the birth of kinetic energy in the form of this infinite inertial momentum imploding. And then because it implodes, it reaches some threshold density limit and then rebounds and explodes. And that's where you end up with the Big Bang and the creation of all things and the constant expansion of the universe, etc., 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 all because of this one thing. Now, the reason that that's all blasphemic is because of the fact that if I say that that's all that there is, then there isn't a God. And so then there's not really any purpose to anything. It's just a happy coincidence. It's just a happy accident that everything ended up the way that it is. Not only that, but it makes existence a crime, because if you were to use nothing, the ultimate zeroth original state of all things, as your measure, then everything after that has been imperfect, because before that everything was crystalline and changeless, and there wasn't any room for deviation or error or noise or conflict or crunching or scraping or anything of the sort. It was all very harmonious because it was all nothing, or at the very least, it was all inertial momentum, not moving anywhere, and perfectly stabilized and perfectly homogeneous, and there was no deviation and no problems. The problems happened when things started to change, and so then we drop out of perfection into imperfection, and we end up with a chaotic mess, only after heat death to end up right back at nothing, which then, of course, becomes a static certainty unto itself, and because of that certainty it manifests, and when it manifests as inertial momentum and infinite mass, which then implodes upon itself because of infinite gravity, which then causes it to rebound and explode as a Big Bang, thus causing everything in existence yet again. So we can keep doing this as many times as it takes in order for us to crystallize before we end up imploding again back into this heat death, nothing crap that we've been stuck in. Now, how do we get past the nothing now that we see the logical validity of the argument? Well, you can assert that nothing never was, and we simply skip right past it and invoke God instead of the infinite mass. We say that there is this timeless creator being that can't ever change because they're timeless, and then we end up, instead of with an objective beginning, we end up with a subjective beginning, with a subject who has an artistic view and a subjectively valuable standpoint and intent that everything in existence revolves around, whether it knows it or not. And we end up with a subjectively valuable, artistic, purposeful existence. Whereas if we choose to use the logically valid viewpoint that everything started with nothing, then we don't have any subjective value to anything. We end up with nihilistic objective realism, or realism, because it takes the objective world as being gospel, and we place all of our faith in whatever the objective world is, instead of it being anything to deal with subjectivity, which we would then see as being a projection from objectivity into subjectivity, rather than subjectivity into objectivity, giving the hierarchy a completely opposing view, such that on one hand we've got God the artist as having the highest realm of subjective value, and existence as a metaphysical entity which only has objectively shadowy projections of the subjective. And we move from that by saying that everything started from nothing, like I had been arguing for, which is the argument for lucidity, at which point there is no subjective view other than the one that we come up with on our own, which is, of course, erroneous, because it isn't justified by anything, because everything is justified by nothing, which means there's no justification, and everything ends up becoming nihilistic. And so you can choose between those two, and then you can say the fact that you even can make both of those arguments using the same evidence and equally logically valid arguments on both sides, but yet they're completely different conclusions and completely different subjectively contextual values, that I just simply choose to quit the field, and I am agnostic, and I don't take any claim on either side, and choose then the rest in the demiurge. And so you get the three choices. Always. Always.